Brian Perez from K-Wave 107.9 here at Calvary Chapel, Costa Mesa for the 2014 Calvary Chapel Senior Pastors Conference. And with me here, Allister Begg from Parkside Church in Ohio. Allister, great seeing you again.
Thank you. It's nice to be here.
Saw you at Calvary Chapel Moreno or Murrieta. I can't remember which one, but it was a few years ago when you were down here in Southern California.
That's right.
So it's great to see you again.
Thank you. It's nice to be back.
You're not part of a Calvary Chapel church per se.
Right.
Back in the 60s, 70s, what was it like hearing about the Jesus People movement going on in Southern California? Did you hear about it?
Yes, I did, and I was in Britain at that time.
Okay.
And I was absolutely intrigued by it because I'm a child of the 60s. I was brought up I was born in the 50s, and so I was very much involved in that whole pop culture scene.
Mm-hmm.
And sorry, excuse my voice, but
Nope.
as the word began to get out of Southern California that there was this guy who had essentially taken on the hippies and had decided to do it in a way that didn't ask them to become something different before they heard this good news, that just really jibed with me. You know, I thought, well, that makes a lot of sense. You know, we don't ask guys to quit being businessmen so they can hear the gospel.
Right.
And so I was fascinated by it. And then, of course, a lot of the music that was coming out at that time was finding its way across the ocean. Larry Norman,
right.
second chapter of Acts, Barry McGuire, you know, a lot of those people, you know, I was listening to.
Wow. Now you say that as a child of the 60s, so you grew up listening to a lot of the music of the 60s, and you often incorporate that into your sermons. You'll use lyrics from the different Motown songs and things. How does that? Do you get a reaction from your audience?
I actually got
Positive, negative?
I got a negative reaction to it in a letter just a couple of weeks ago, where
really?
a guy said that he wrote in to say, tell Begg to quit doing that because it's such a jolly nuisance and it reminds me of my past. The reason the letter stood out was because he was completely out on a limb in relationship to most of the responses. Most of the responses are, you know, when you identify something by means of a lyric like that, it's actually very helpful to me.
Yeah.
And I don't do it like go look for it. It's just in me so much. Like this morning, you know, in the course of addressing the issue of how every sin is an inside job, I was quoted from Lennon's Imagine album where he has a song with a refrain, one thing you can't hide is when you're crippled inside. Well, that just works, you know.
Yeah.
So I don't do it as a, you know, like to be clever or to be cute or anything. People can give scientific illustrations because they're scientists, or the mathematical illustrations because they're mathematicians. I'm neither of those things. So if you start to hear me, you know, trying to explain pi r squared as it relates to, you know, what some piece of theology, then you know that I had to be looking it up in a book. But at least so. But when it comes to art, when it comes to history, when it comes to music, then I'm in my own territory.
Right. Now, you mentioned the sermon that you gave this morning at the pastors' conference. It was about marital fidelity and pastors and leaders. In a nutshell, what was it that you?
Well, basically, I did two things. Well, three things actually. I read 2 Samuel 11, and the horrible story of David's collapse in relationship to Bathsheba. We read Psalm 51, where you have his penitential prayer following that, and we read 1 Corinthians 9, where Paul says, you know, let him who thinks he stands take heed lest he falls. So essentially, that's what we were doing. We were looking at what happened to this guy who was described as a man after God's own heart, and yet he collapses like a ton of bricks. And it was really a word of exhortation and warning, especially in light of the fact that in the last 6 months, you know, within the Calvary movement, you know, we've had a large oak tree that has fallen down in the forest. And it's not my job to come in and lecture anybody. I'm not seeking to do that, but I felt that coming from the outside, I had an opportunity to say something to these men who obviously are recoiling from that and reflecting on it.
Right. And you wrote a book about the subject.
A long time ago, yeah.
Yeah. What's the title? You mentioned it today, Andy.
It was they called it Lasting Love, and the subtitle is How to Avoid Marital Failure.
And it's available through Calvary Distribution and the Chapel Store. So look it up online. Allister Begg, thank you so much for your time today. God bless you, sir.
It's nice to chat.
All right. Brian Perez for K-Wave 107.9 at the Calvary Chapel Senior Pastors Conference.